Now, the coronavirus outbreak has forced the world to do things differently, from schooling to business and even elections. Now, as you can see, the Democratic Alliance has decided to hold its federal Congress online on the 31st of October as well as the 1st of November this year, when it will elect the new party leader. But there are several countries that have explored electronic election and stopped because of difficulties or in some cases concerns about security and reliability. To discuss this further, I'm joined now by Terry, Tselane, Executive Chairman of the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa. Good to have you with us once again this afternoon, Terry. Now, I know that you've been a huge advocate of e-voting for quite a long time. We are also seeing now the DA readying itself for its electronic voting. But we do know as well that there have been some concerns, and some of those concerns involve accessibility. How accessible is online voting for, quote-unquote, the general public?
Well, I think what is going to be important is that before electronic voting is introduced, a mechanism must be put in place in order to ensure that even those people who are in the far-flung areas are able to have access to electronic voting. Now, I know that there are people who will say in certain areas, unfortunately, there is no access to data, and also that other people might not actually be able to have access to the electronic mechanism. Now, once electronic mechanism has been introduced, it means in those kind of areas, some kind of measures would have to be put in place, where a kiosk would have to be put in place, where a person who wants to exercise a vote can still be able to go to something that resembles a voting station and still be able to cast a vote there.
Are you then saying, Terry, that it's still early days and it's still far too early to completely do away with the manual style of voting that we are all traditionally used to?
No, what I'm suggesting is that the manual way of voting has got to go. We've got to introduce mechanism to make sure that it completely disappears from the system. But there is also an acknowledgement that this cannot be done immediately, that some mechanism would have to be put in place, and it will take time before those mechanisms are put in place. An issue that I am raising is that there are also possibilities that people who are in the rural areas may not necessarily have access to electronic voting mechanism, and therefore the election management body would have to put in place those mechanisms to make sure that there is something that resembles a kiosk where they can actually be able to go and still cast a vote electronically. Almost something like an ATM machine where you can actually be able to go and then you have a list of all the political parties that are contesting the elections, and you just touch a screen for a political party that you want, and then you then vote using those mechanisms.
Do we have any such mechanisms in place, perhaps some technological developments that are being put in place in order to ensure that those who are in rural areas are able to access such?
Yeah, there are quite a number of countries that are already doing that. But I think what coronavirus has done is that it has actually forced people to begin to look at other mechanisms that they can actually be able to use in order to be able to have elections. This thing of voting being postponed and elections being postponed indefinitely will, in the long run, have a negative effect on democratic processes. And therefore, I assume that the majority of election management bodies will begin to look into mechanisms that can be put in place in order to make it easier for people to have access to voting.
Can online voting be rigged?
Yes, it can be rigged, and that's why the cybersecurity issue becomes so important when you introduce electronic voting. But the level of technology right now has increased. The cybersecurity mechanisms have increased, and I think it is still possible to have online voting because of the kind of cybersecurity that already exists within the society. If you leave electronic voting mechanism without really checking the cybersecurity aspect, then you are becoming vulnerable to hacking and to all sorts of vulnerabilities.
Now, we see that South Korea is one of the very few countries that's managed to have a successful election in the midst of COVID-19. Focusing on the U.S., they're about to be having their election shortly. How has COVID-19 affected their electoral system and even their voting, specifically online voting?
Well, it will definitely have an enormous impact on their elections. But, you know, the U.S., to a large extent, has been having what they call electronic voting as well as remote voting. In other words, some people who do not have access to the voting stations have been using what we call postal voting to participate in the electoral process. I'm aware that the U.S. president has actually been criticizing that system, but it's a system that has actually been there over the years. So for those individuals who were not able to have access to the voting stations, they would actually do postal voting, or what they call remote voting.
And how does one factor the voter turnout? Traditionally, has there been a greater voter turnout electronically than manually?
Absolutely. You know, with the electronic voting, if you look at the number of people who are able to participate as a result of electronic voting, the voter turnout in all those countries is much higher. And then also, you do not even have what we call votes that are wasted or that are marked wrongly during an election.